All right. So what I want to do in this session is to just to take, as there are many ways of getting into this. I said, well, let's just take what I think of as 4 of the really big ideas from the Old Testament. So we're moving from talking about, what do we know about ancient Palestine and Israel and how the books got to be written. We're sort of parking that stuff, although it's not finished, and we're focusing more. So what do we have in these books? Okay, what are the really big headline themes that run through the books? And they may not be the ones that we're used to hearing about in church, because the church reads the Old Testament through a Christian filter. Okay? And so what we think of as really important, like sin and forgiveness, just don't matter that much in the Old Testament. That's not what it's on about. Okay? So part of it is choosing to read from slightly different perspectives. So I'm going to focus on 4 particular themes. I'm going to basically introduce those themes and try and shake you up a little bit, and then leave some time for questions, discussion, or for gathering up the tar and feathers that you can use during lunchtime. Okay? So one of the themes will be Torah and covenant, playing with those related ideas. Torah, covenant. Second theme will be land and power. The third theme will be prophecy and justice. Okay? And the fourth theme will be wisdom and hope. Now, they are cleverly disguised in your handout with these pictures, okay? Which the text has been shadowed out by the pictures, so you'll just have to pay attention. All right, so let's have a look at these. So one of the first things I want to make is that a lot of the time people, I think, have got the wrong kind of metaphor for the Bible. Where I think there's some value in thinking about the Bible as a bit like a map and compass, a lot of people think they've got a smartphone. And it's actually going to tell them what decisions to make and where to turn. Okay? Whereas if you're using a map and compass, you've actually got to look around, pay attention to where you are, locate yourself in the real world, and then identify what equates to that location on the map, orient the map correctly, and then start making some calculations. A much more interactive and interesting process, particularly if you get any one of those things wrong. And you walk very accurately in the wrong place, from the wrong place, in the wrong direction, to a destination you had no desire to reach. Okay? And I suspect that can happen as well in using the Bible. So I love this sign. They were quite common a couple of years ago, and this I suspect actually is from Southport. But ignore, just because of the building in the back, Chevron Renaissance happens to be in the back. It was just a Google image. But ignore GPS.
There are several of those on the highway between here and Porcupine.
Indeed. That's where I first saw them when we were staying at Coffs Harbour a couple of years ago. So I want to make the point that the scriptures perhaps are more like a compass than a GPS. And most of the kids in our class, and indeed many of the people in our congregation, they really want a smartphone. They don't want a compass. Okay, they just want the answers. They don't want to work out how to figure it out. They just want to know when to turn. And always, of course, when to turn right. Okay, sorry. I shouldn't let my politics seep into my presentation. All right. So part of what I think is going on here is that we need to transfer the genre studies, the genre analysis skills, interpretation skills, which we, particularly our students, acquire in school, and they get really good at doing this in English and communication studies and media studies and so on. And it's like when they walk into the religion class, none of that gets transferred, and that I think is a real shame. So we need to bring into our religion classes what we know about genre and integrate what we know about truth and meaning, which is much more subtle and nuanced and sophisticated in all the other subject areas apart from religion. And surely an Anglican school can be about nuanced religious knowledge rather than simply black and white, take it from the top kind of stuff. So using the Bible in ways that respect its genre. So if we're reading a psalm, recognise we're dealing with a liturgical text and it's a community song of some kind, whether it's a lament or a thanksgiving or whatever. These are community songs. Prophetic literature. Appreciate the dynamics of prophetic literature. Appreciate the value of stories, and that from a Jewish perspective, the historical books are prophets, are prophetic literature, and so on. So respecting the genre we're dealing with, and not thinking of the Bible as a book of answers, so much as a map. Okay? A map that's been left by people that have made the journey before, and they think we'll find this helpful as we make the journey. Okay? And another metaphor I like is that it's a bit like inheriting from your recently deceased grandmother a shoebox full of all her favourite press cuttings and photos. And every one of those memories had a historical context, whether we can find it or not. Okay? And of course we try and piece the story together, even if just to make the PowerPoint presentation for the funeral. But it's about creating a story which makes sense of other people's memories. And that's part of what we're doing, of course, with the Bible. Now, that's not how the church has encouraged us to think about the Bible. We've been encouraged to think about the Bible as being given to us by God with all the answers. But you won't find an index, and you won't find a chapter on successful living. Okay? You won't find a chapter on happiness. It's all mixed up in there together. It's like grandma's shoebox. And in fact, all those memories might tell us why her life was so meaningful, but it's not neatly organised into categories to make it easy for us, because we have to live our own life. We have to do it all again. We can't just imitate somebody else. So making meaning of the Bible is more like art appreciation. Okay? It's not rocket science. It's more like being an art critic or a literary critic, or just reflecting on life. Okay, so let's just look at each of these themes in succession. Feel free to interrupt, howl with protest, throw shoes or whatever strikes you as appropriate. Glenn would probably like you to throw $50 notes, but then he'll want them. So anyway, let's see how we go. So the first one I want to look at is law and covenant, or Torah and covenant. And of course the image I'll put there to kick us off is the image of the burning bush. Okay? One of those great classic stories of the religious tradition. It was somewhat interesting, disappointing when I was one of my first visits to Mount Sinai, and I went into the little chapel that's at St. Catherine's Monastery, at the foot of Mount Sinai. The monks proudly showed us the burning bush, which is conveniently growing inside the chapel, and it doesn't look in the slightest bit charred. Okay? It's a miracle. But this is an important part of their tradition, that they've trained the bush to grow inside the church. So,
That's a metaphor there in itself, isn't it?
There is. Yeah, and we expect it to look, I expected it to look charred. But anyway, it looked perfectly healthy. So, Torah and covenant. These are the ideas that struck me as the absolute first cab off the rank, top drawer kind of thing in terms of big ideas in the Old Testament. Torah, covenant. And I'm using the Hebrew word Torah rather than the English word law. Okay? Torah is much more inclusive than our English word law. Okay? Torah are the rules we live by, the wisdom we live by, the obligations that have been put upon us, not simply laws to be ticked off, that kind of thing. So just using law or laws, in a sense, trivialises it. Both Torah and covenant are ideas which are central, of course, for Jewish identity. And they're also very important for Christian identity, but they take on different significance. They're constructed slightly differently. Torah is not just about these are the rules which you have to fulfill in order to be in the in-group, but they are part of being the covenant people, the community. So they're very much tied up with identity and covenant. Now, certainly Christians have often misunderstood the significance of law, of Torah, and I suspect even Paul misunderstood the significance of Torah. Paul's own experience seems to have given him a jaundiced perspective on Torah. And that, of course, has been very powerful in terms of New Testament attitudes to Torah. And so Christians tend to associate Torah with terms like legalistic and Pharisee and external observance, that kind of thing. But Torah is actually something far more internal. Torah, if you like, is sacred wisdom. These are the things that define us from a Jewish perspective. And one of the ways of really getting our head around that is actually to look at Psalm 119. That's the big long one with 176 verses that you might once have read through or at least played with during a long and boring sermon. Okay, because it sort of goes forever. It's an interesting example of how do these texts get written. It's in fact an acrostic. So it's structured around the alphabet, structured around the Hebrew alphabet, of course. Not the Greek alphabet, not the English alphabet. Okay? And the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, and so there are 22 sections in Psalm 119. And the first word or the first line of each of the 22 sections begins with the appropriate letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, this is not something that somebody's just chucked together one rainy Thursday afternoon when they had nothing else to do. Okay? This is a carefully constructed literary exercise. So that tells me that the person who's produced this is somebody who's literate, well-educated, and has leisure from the kind of productive tasks that actually contribute to the well-being of the community in terms of farming or whatever. And as you read through Psalm 119, it's loaded with synonyms, which are different ways of teasing out, in good Hebrew poetic method, you tease out meanings by putting things in parallel, which just say it slightly differently, or just extend or sort of qualify what's been said as you put what might be in some ways inconsistent things, put them side by side, and the net effect is to nuance the statement. So what we find in Psalm 119 is not only a very intentional literary theological reflection on Torah, but lots and lots of synonyms for Torah, including wisdom and principles and instruction and so on. So you get all these other terms which are being used, which are synonyms for Torah. So Psalm 119 is a great way to try to understand the spirit of Torah within the text of the Old Testament. Because the story of Torah is particularly connected with Mount Sinai, Moses, Ten Commandments, carved in stone and so on. But remember, that scene is only for the 10 Commandments, which technically in Hebrew are the 10 words. Okay, and because Hebrew the verbs are highly inflected, and the word for no or not is prefixed on the front of the verb, you can actually do a version of the 10 Commandments, which is just 10 words. And in the Exodus 34 version of the rewriting of the 10 Commandments, we actually get these are the 10 words which God wrote down for Moses. Now there are many more words than 10 in the final version, but the idea of the 10 statements, the 10 phrases, the 10 axioms, the 10 devarim, the 10 words. Okay. So it's a classic story, and of course in that classic story of Mount Sinai, the Torah comes from God himself. Now, we then get the rest of Exodus, all of Leviticus and half of Numbers, with even more laws and regulations being promulgated. But the idea is that, in effect, the people of Israel, they've come out of Egypt, they've got to the mountain, they stay there for, as I said, second half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, first half of Numbers, they do not move on. So it's like you sort of interrupt the storyline and you download all this traditional material about how the community is to govern its and regulate its life. And it all comes from God. Okay, that's the implication of the story. The way our life is structured is itself a gift from God, is the way the story is telling us. Now, of course, the Jews or the Israelites were not the first people to use that metaphor. Hammurabi had used a similar metaphor hundreds of years earlier with his Code of Hammurabi, where he received the law of Babylon from their God. So it was an ancient sort of rhetorical strategy to say, well, the things that really hold us together, we didn't just make them up. They came from God. That's the kind of message. And in what we're getting in the covenant, of course, are in material which is going to address questions of identity. Who are these people? Why? How are they different from other people? Questions of relationship with God and relationships with each other. That's seen particularly, of course, in the Ten Commandments, but also in all the minutiae of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Everything from sexual relationships to how to deal with crime, how to deal with disease, how to deal with people shifting the boundary post of your property, and all kinds of stuff of everyday life. Of course, just mentioning the boundary post, if you're wandering through the desert with goats and sheep and so on, you don't have boundary posts. Okay? These are not issues that nomadic people are exactly the people who will ignore the boundary posts. Okay, so some of the laws which we find in the traditions in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers presuppose a settled urban village life. Okay, they would be meaningless in the desert. Okay, but of course, the way I'm approaching this is that these texts are not written down by Moses. These are texts gathered up much, much later. Moses is the key character, along with God, of course. And the point is that Israel's life together is being seen as sourced at Sinai. So it goes to questions of identity, goes to questions of relationship, and it goes to the questions of a future, because implicit in the covenant is that if you live this way, if you keep this commandment, then we have a future together. God and us have a future together. Okay? Then you will live long in the land. Okay? Implication being, if you don't, then you won't live long in the land. You'll lose the gift of land. And it's interesting that so much of the Old Testament, the storyline suggests it's being written when they're outside the land. Either in the wilderness, hoping to get to the land, or in the exile, wishing they were still in the land. So the exile, or the not yet in the land experience, is one of the kind of themes underlying a lot of what we have in the Old Testament. Okay, so and I guess one of the points I want to bring out here is that the law, or the Torah, is not the condition which, once you have done this, then I will bless you. Rather, it's I have blessed you, and that's why you will live this way. Okay? Torah is a way for Israel to express her gratitude for the blessings which God has already given them. It is not the thing they have to do in order to get a reluctant God to bless them. Okay? And that there's no doubt that the individual characters in the story are not always moral, well-behaved, ethical characters. That's not the point. The point is that Israel's story about God is a story of being blessed despite who they are. Yeah, but we have this thing about repentance. Okay, that's not in the story in the Old Testament. people can repent and be sorry at various times, but it's not a case of you miserable sinners, you're going to hell, but if you turn and repent, I will change your future prospects. It's, I have chosen you, I have blessed you, and you will now live this way. This is the way you will organise yourself. Now, sure, there are still enough stories in there about don't step out of line or I'll get you. Okay, that stuff is still in there. But the underlying dynamic of Torah is not, I keep the law, therefore God will bless me. Rather, it's God has blessed me, therefore I choose to keep the law as a way of expressing my gratitude. So it's a theology of gratitude rather than of compliance. Okay? Which is a rather nice theology, I think. And particularly in the part of the Pentateuch, the Pentateuch being the 5 books, the part of the Torah or the books of Moses, which we call the Book of Deuteronomy, it has its own vocabulary, it has its own kind of distinctive style. And one of the characteristic stylistic things about Deuteronomy is that you shall love the Lord your God. Okay? Not simply you will tick the boxes, but you will love the Lord your God. So it goes to a different lexicon, uses different vocabulary. So Torah and covenant. Now there are lots of other things about covenant we might want to tease out, but let me just introduce the 4 themes and then we'll just have an open conversation. Next one I want to look at is land and power. And I don't have any photographs of Joshua, capturing Jericho after marching around it for 7 days and blowing trumpets and so on. But I do have photographs of more recent people doing very similar things. Okay? And so one of the really contested and difficult aspects is this relationship between land and power. And as some of you have already picked up and commented, I do have a sympathy and an affinity with the Palestinian experience, as well as having a great many friends who are Israeli Jews and whose right to live anywhere in the land I would equally defend. The question is, how do we do it? How do we do it with justice? Okay, so land and power. So there's no question about the fact that land plays a really central role in the Old Testament text. I mean, the part of the kind of the formative story of the Jewish people is that they were people without land and God gave them this land to be theirs. Okay. Now that's both an ancient story and a modern story used by the Jewish people. In the end, of course, it comes down to who's got the biggest sword or who's got the biggest gun, doesn't it? Theology doesn't settle this. Never has. Okay? So, for all the theologizing that goes on, it comes down to how people treat each other rather than what God is telling us to do. Because at the end of the day, whoever wins will say that's what God wanted. Yeah? Otherwise, it would have turned out differently. So it's a tricky one. Okay. So land is nonetheless, the whole question of land and how Israel will have the land, how it will get the land, and so on, plays in this, whether it's the stories about Abraham or whether it's the later stories of Joshua or people in the exile and so on. There are these issues about the land. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, much of the biblical tradition, much of the Old Testament, seems to have been written by people who at that stage were not in the land. And land is like something you'd like to have rather than something you already enjoy and you're wondering how best to use it. So there is that dimension to the land theme in the Old Testament as well. Land, like justice, is often something we aspire to rather than something we have. And of course the issue of land and power, when we read through the biblical story, particularly the Old Testament, raises the question of what do we mean by the promised land? What sort of promise is this? And for whose benefit is the promise being made? And it's interesting. If you read the story, say the stories about Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, he's to go to a place that God will show him, and he won't tell him where it is until he gets there. That's really helpful. But when you get there, I'll tell you you've arrived. Okay? And when you go to this land, you will settle there amongst the people of the land, and the peoples of the land will bless themselves because you are there. Now that's that's not ethnic cleansing. That's not exclusion, that's not expulsion. Okay? That's a small group of people coming to live amongst a larger group of people, and because of the blessings they enjoy, everybody around them is going to say, we're glad you've moved into the neighbourhood. We like having you in the neighbourhood. It's good for our kids that you're here. Okay? Now that's an interesting dynamic, whether it's in school or whether it's a parish. How do the neighbours feel about having a school at the end of their street? I don't know. As I drove down this morning, I noticed the bitumen is wearing out pretty fast, and I wondered if the traffic flow to the thing at the other end of the street is contributing to that, and how the houses with the potholes feel about that. But there are other stuff as well. Okay? And particularly in our context, as in context of Australia and the West and the church and clergy abuse of children, is it good, would the neighbours say it's good for our kids to have a church or a youth group or a school in the neighbourhood? Or would they tend to keep their kids away from us? Okay. So what kind of promise for whose benefit? Now, one of the interesting dynamics in the Old Testament laws are the laws for the aliens. Okay, the laws for the resident aliens, the ger, and how they were to be given equal rights. There's to be one law for the stranger and one law for the Israelite. Okay. Everybody's to be treated equally. Everybody's to have access to justice. Might have some relevance to Australia's treatment of asylum seekers. And it's one in terms of Palestinian liberation theology, because there's this issue: how does a Palestinian Christian read the Old Testament? How does a Palestinian Christian deal with the promise of the land? Okay? And because it's a promise that comes with a requirement to do justice. Okay? It's a requirement, it's a promise that comes with the sense that you use the land as a tangible, specific location in time and place where you can live the covenant. It's not simply something to be exploited and used for one particular group's benefit. So the question of land and power runs through the Old Testament. Because there's the question of location. If position is everything, then Palestine is not the best position. Okay? There are many other places in the world, even in the Mediterranean world, which would be a much more pleasant location to be given. So if we're trying to develop a kind of an eyes wide open theological reading of the Old Testament, what does it mean that our tradition says God put the covenant people on the crossroads where the nations cross over when they're wanting to attack each other? And what's the point of being at that strategic location? Is it to join in the violence, or is it to have some other kind of ameliorating effect on the violence? Land and power. I'm told, I don't have any hard data on this, but I'm told that amongst these sort of Palestinian communities in the north of Israel, you will find a couple, I think it's 3 Christian villages that are entirely Christian, except for a few renters that are Muslims, but they're not really from our village. Okay, that's what one person told me. But anyway, there are, I think, in the West Bank and Israel, there are 6 Christian villages which are 100% Christian villages. That's all that's left. Okay. However, you'll find Christians living in other villages that are not majority Christian villages. You'll find Christians living with Muslims in a village, and you'll find Christians living with Druze in a village. And you'll find Christians, Druze, and Muslims in a village. But I'm told you'll never find Muslims and Druze in the village. Okay? The presence of the Christians historically has made a difference to the communal violence between otherwise estranged groups. Now that doesn't mean that Christians have an untarnished record for tolerance and generosity. If you drive into particularly the village, and it's not the only one I'm sure, but I remember driving into the village of Fasuto up on the Lebanese border, far north of Israel. As you drive in, there's a large statue of Elijah, sword in hand, enemy throat in his other hand, one of the prophets of Baal, and he's about to slit the throat of the pagan prophet of Baal. Welcome to our Christian village. Okay, pagans need not apply. All right? So it's not that Christians are immune to violence and prejudice, but it is the case that in terms of sharing the land, sharing the village, living in situations where at least since the fall of the Byzantine Empire, Christians have not been the people with power in the Middle East. Okay, unlike the West, where we're still kind of addicted to power. Okay, so the sort of Byzantine Greek Orthodox experience of being Christian for the best part of 1,000 years is that we're not in charge, but we can make a difference. Okay? We're not in charge, but we can make a difference. And that to me gets us into this issue about land and power. Do we own the land? Do we control the land? Is it my land, or is it land that we share? We share the land, we share the power, we share the blessing. So part of what we're dealing with in the Old Testament is, of course, and a couple of people I think referred to this earlier, there's the problem of sacred violence, and there's the problem of tribalised religion. And that's endemic with the Old Testament. And indeed it's not missing from the New Testament. I'm not suggesting that it's typical of the Old Testament, but gee, everything's sweet and rosy in the New Testament. Read the book of Revelation. Okay? Jesus is going to kick butts when he arrives on the white horse. Okay? Now, who's the guy on the white horse? Well, of course, it's George and the dragon. It's Jesus at the end of time, or so on. But you know, there's a whole iconography around that role as well. So, religious violence, whether we're talking of some of the traditions in Joshua and Judges, whether we're talking about Samuel hacking the king of the Moabites to death in front of the altar because Saul didn't kill him in the first place, whether we're talking about Ezra, Nehemiah, whatever. You know, there's a Taliban dimension to some monotheistic religion, and it's the dark side of our own tradition. Okay. The tradition, the sort of monotheistic religious tradition of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam has contributed enormously because it focuses and centralises things, and those cultural benefits have been huge. But there is a dark side, and if there's only one God and everything else is non-God, okay, and if our God is life, then what you have must be death. And there's a problem of sort of binary opposites with a monotheistic mindset. That doesn't mean we abandon monotheism, but we pay attention to how it might be practiced and how it might give permission for violence and prejudice. And still we end up with asking ourselves, so where's the blessing for the landless? Okay, where's the blessing for the landless? Well, part of the Old Testament story is, of course, that it is a promise of land to the landless. But what happens when the landless become landed? Yeah, they start treating the other people badly. That, of course, would never happen in our experience. All right? That's how quickly we forget. Okay? But remember, part of the theological justification for some of the instructions in the different versions of the Ten Commandments is, you know, for instance, you are to keep the Sabbath day, you and your slaves, because you were once slaves in Egypt. So everybody is to benefit, not just the Israelite. Everybody is to benefit. And of course, with a larger kind of eco-theology perspective, we're slowly, some of us at least, in my case, very slowly, are learning to ask questions about, so from the perspective of Earth, where is the blessing in this? Okay? So a story like Noah and the flood, which is now back on the agenda, courtesy to Russell Crowe. But what's the promise? What's the good news bit in that story from the perspective of Earth? Let's move beyond the focus on humans and see the larger web of life. Okay. Interesting. The other 2 weeks ago now, I guess it was, I was catching a bus in Toronto to go across to get the train because of their lovely integrated, efficient transport system. I got on the bus. I think we checked whether it was enough money, whether what we were paying was sufficient, and the driver says, "So you're Australians?" And we went, "No, yeah." He said, "Okay, well I'll take you to the station, but only if one of you stays here to talk to me." So guess who got that gig? Okay. So I spent the next 40 minutes sort of leaning over the driver's seat, basically, hanging on to whatever bar was just by the entrance. As we stopped and started, waves of people got on and off, and there's this clown standing in the front end of the bus talking to the driver. Turned out to be a really interesting guy, an interesting conversation. Somehow or other, we got onto the fact that he was Jewish. Never actually thought of Jewish bus drivers before. They normally have slightly own the bus here. It's the city council bus, but yeah. So he's a Jewish bus driver, and I think it came up because he asked had I been to Russia, and I said no, I tend to go to the Middle East. Where do you go in the Middle East? Oh, I work on a dig in Israel. Wow, I'm Jewish, and that's kind of how it started. So we went into this whole conversation about his own journey that he started telling me about how 15, 20 years ago he was a Bible-believing Jew who saw his people as the chosen people, and that there were Jews and there were the rest. And God and he were only interested in the Jews. And that over time his life experience and the reading he's been doing and so on has led him to have a broader, more generous view. Without losing his Jewishness, he's come to see that the blessing is for everybody, and in particular it has to be for the Palestinians as well as for the Jews. He's choosing not to live in Israel, but he said if he did go to Israel now, he would have great difficulty identifying with the Jewish community because of the suffering of the Palestinian community. Okay? So this sense of broadening the sense of where the blessing is. But we're learning to not only think beyond the chosen people category or beyond the humanity category, but to actually ask questions about the web of life, the bigger, larger web of life. And so our theology is beginning to be informed by sort of a concern about ecology. Okay, so land and power. In what way does being the people of the covenant carry a blessing for the land, rather than giving us the right to exploit the land? Okay, and they, of course, are questions that are relevant in our continent, in our context as well. Okay, prophets and justice. This image is meant to evoke Elijah or somebody like that, kind of, about to call down fire from heaven on those, on the sacrifice, and then lead to the slaughter, of course, of the prophets of Baal. Okay. So prophecy and justice. And I'm deliberately pairing prophecy with justice rather than prophecy with fulfillment. Okay? Prophecy and justice. Because there's a lot more to prophecy than prediction. There are elements of prediction in prophecy, but they tend to be for the immediate implications of the message which has been given by the prophet to his audience. Okay? There's not a lot of point in an Old Testament prophet predicting something that's going to happen in 700 years' time. Neither he nor his audience will be around to know whether his words came true. Okay? One of the points of validation for a prophet was the true prophet was the prophet whose words came true. So predicting stuff for hundreds and hundreds of years in the future isn't going to work in the original context. Okay? So we need to rethink prophecy to put it into a different genre than prediction. Prophecy is more about speaking for God, about the things that matter to God, where in the opinion of God, the people who have power are not doing the right thing. Prophets tend to have very short professional lives. They don't last long, generally speaking. No. Okay? Prophets are not really popular with the people that have power. So, more often than not, speaking for God means speaking truth to power. Okay? And that's way more challenging, actually, than say, let me tell you what's going to happen around here in 500 years' time. Not that you or I will be here to worry about it. Okay? So, speaking truth to power. So what the prophets are doing, in a sense, is to claim the core values of Torah and covenant and then apply those values to the real situation they observed happening in front of them. Interestingly, the prophets in the Old Testament rarely, if ever, quote the Torah. You would think it would be a laid-out Messiah. Hey guys, we've got 10 big rules here, and you've just broken items 3, 7, and 8. The prophets don't ever do that. This is interesting. Why? Well, my suggestion is because the Torah hadn't been written yet. But in fact, the writing up of the Torah is actually the fruit of the prophetic ministry rather than the source of the prophet's ministry. And that's not the kind of thing you can prove, because how do you prove something isn't there at a particular point in time? But it's interesting, even the way the Old Testament itself tells the story, the kings reigning in Jerusalem don't do the kind of stuff which Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy says they should be doing. I mean, even stuff as obvious as Passover, keeping Shabbat, circumcision. None of that stuff ever gets a mention in the stories of David and Solomon and his successors until you get down to King Josiah in 2 Kings 22, thereabouts, and in the year 629, something along those lines. And it actually says they were doing some renovations at the temple. You don't renovate the temple, you don't renovate the cathedral, unless you're changing the theology of the place. Okay, so what Josiah was doing is Josiah was ripping out the religious objects which were part and parcel of Judah's subjugation to the Assyrian Empire. So he's taking out these religious artifacts which implied the supremacy of the Assyrians. And as they make these renovations, the workers discover in the back room a copy of Deuteronomy, what appears to be the central part of Deuteronomy. And they say, look at this, Your Majesty, we're meant to be doing this, this and this. And he says, gee whiz guys, we better start doing that. Blow the trumpet, let's have a festival. It actually says, and Josiah proclaimed a Passover. There had never been such a Passover in Jerusalem, and even from the time of Joshua. So often if we actually read the Old Testament rather than just talk about it, there's actually stuff in there that gives us like another point of view about the big point of view, that kind of thing. So now we don't know what exactly they found in the back room and whether the ink was still wet because they just stuck it in there the day before. Okay. Joe Bajoki Peterson always said, and you never have an inquiry unless you know what it's going to find. And the problem for him was the Fitzgerald inquiry was called when he was in Japan. And there was an acting premier. Okay. Brought the house down. Okay. So, yeah, politics being what it is, you certain cynicism and skepticism comes in at times. So, so it's interesting that as you get further into the prophetic, later in the prophetic literature, and particularly the stuff from the exile and after the exile, you begin to get more explicit references to the Mosaic traditions. But the Mosaic traditions appear not to be important in books like Amos and Hosea and even the earlier chapters of Isaiah and so on. So you think, what's going on here? But still, they're calling on the values which we now find in the Pentateuch, and they're applying those values to the public life of the kingdom of Judah, or in the case of the northern prophets, the northern kingdom of Israel. So just to be clear about that, in the Old Testament story talks about Israel and Judah. Israel is the area to the north, what is now the West Bank, and Jezreel, and Judah is the area just around Jerusalem. Okay? And our Bible comes from Jerusalem. Okay? But most of the ancient people of Israel lived in the northern kingdom of Israel. And for much of that history, the southern kingdom was like a province of the northern kingdom. But of course, that's not how they tell the story. But they were much better connected further north. So again, it's interesting that according to the southerners, those nasty northerners were worshippers of the golden calf. We're talking about Elijah and Elisha.
Probably not.
Yeah, they're not famous for worshipping golden calves, really. Okay? So there might be a little bit of spin going on in the way the southern kingdom, after the exile, talks about the long-banished northern kingdom, whose legacy they're actually taking over. Because now they want to be called Israel. But Israel is a word that belongs further north. So anyway, prophecy and justice. People drawing on the values of covenant and Torah and calling those with power to act justly. Remember that wonderful text out of Micah. What does the Lord require of you? To love God, do justice, and act with mercy. Okay? Walk humbly with your God. Yeah, Okay. So, and the other adjustment we need to make is that when the prophets of Israel are talking about justice, they're not talking about punishment. They're talking about setting things right. Okay? Whereas our justice system is not about setting things right. It's about blaming somebody and punishing them and not fixing it up. It's not about restitution. Okay? Whereas the king of Israel was expected not simply to say, would you stop bullying the widow next door, but taking some of your resources and giving them back to the widow next door so that her situation is rectified. Okay? Very different sense of justice than what we're thinking of. So the prophets were not into blame as an end goal. They were into restitution, they were into restoration, setting things right. Okay? And there is a predictive element, but the predictive element tends to be in a much shorter time frame, or to be generic. The lion will lay down with the lamb kind of ideal, utopian kind of predictions. Now, let's take one example of that, the famous one, the $60,000 question. Isaiah 7 verse 14. Behold, a virgin will conceive and bear a child, and they'll call his name Emmanuel. Okay? In the context of Jerusalem, round about 730, 731 BCE, what's the meaning of that passage? Okay, well, what's happening is that Jerusalem is isolated, the northern kingdom is not yet wiped out, and so the northern kingdom, sometimes called Ephraim, sometimes called Israel, is in alliance with Syria. Okay, so Israel and Syria are in an alliance against Jerusalem. That's just how the words were used back then. And they're trying to force Jerusalem to join in their alliance as a rebellion against the Assyrians. That's called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis, 731 to 730. the king is out inspecting the city walls and, most importantly, the water system. Because if you turn off the water, the city will have to surrender. Okay? And he's met by Isaiah, who's, we're going to see in another chapter or so, we would see that he has a couple of sons with interesting names like Total Destruction and Speedy Spoil. So he has a bit of track record, this guy, okay? And he comes up to the king and he says, don't worry about it. Don't call to Egypt to back you up, and don't go into this alliance. Just stand firm. Yahweh will be with you. And the king says, oh, Yahweh, Smahweh, kind of go away. What's the point of all this? And so Elijah says, okay, I'm going to pick a sign. Pick us anything you want, from heaven above to Sheol below. It's like, got a pack of cards here. Pick a sign. Okay? And Ahaz says, oh, no, I can't put the Lord our God to the test. So Isaiah says, well, you're going to get a sign. Whether you want it or not, you're going to get a sign. Within 9 months, the baby boys around here are going to be called Emmanuel, God with us, because we will have found out that God was with us all along. And the king goes off to his counting house, and Isaiah goes back to play with his boys with the self-destructing names. Okay? So what Isaiah is saying to the king is, circumstances around here are going to change radically in the next few months. The women that are pregnant right now, when their babies are born, they're going to be called Emmanuel, because I'm right, you're wrong. Okay? Like the boys that were born at the end of the First World War, many of them were given the name Pax. Okay? Because peace. Same sort of idea. Okay? Now that's a promise that makes sense within about a 6-month window of the oracle being delivered. Okay? It makes no sense at all for Isaiah to be talking about the birth of Jesus in 731 years' time. Take off 4 years, whatever. But anyway, it doesn't work. There's no point. Now that's not to say that Matthew hasn't taken the verse out of Isaiah and used it that way. Okay? But Isaiah was talking about a real problem, how to get the king to pay attention. So that's what Isaiah is talking about. And then, of course, the prophetic text, as we know, takes on a life of its own. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years go by, and these words are still being seen as prophetic. And that's why I've got a note at the bottom. This was all relevant. The predictive element is secondary. When these texts are now sacred, but they're about something that happened 500 or 700 years ago, how do you make them relevant? Well, you cherry pick different bits out of them and say that's actually talking about us. Okay? And so you read a predictive element back into the prophets, but the prophets are always speaking then, or imagined to be speaking, about the time of the interpreter. And that's what we find happening, say, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they did their Pesha interpretations of the prophets, and they would say, da-da-da-da-da, quote a line out of the Old Testament, Pesha, this means, and they apply it to themselves in their own community at Qumran. And the early Christians are doing exactly the same thing. They're reading the Old Testament prophecies, and they're picking little texts totally out of context, and saying, and that applies to Jesus. Why? Because for Matthew, Jesus is Emmanuel. It's not his name, okay? I mean, in Matthew chapter 1, he says, and you will call his name Emmanuel, but they don't. They call him Jesus. Actually, they call him Joshua. Okay? And we lose that because we call him Jesus. But his name is Joshua, or in Aramaic, Yeshua. Okay? So Matthew is using the Old Testament to say, look at this. Way back then, people discovered God was with them even when it seemed God was absent. Well, let me tell you about a guy called Jesus. Because we've discovered that in Jesus, God is with us when we thought he was absent. And guess what? It's not just for us. It's also for the foreigners. It's for the non-Jews. Because who turns up next? But a bunch of supposedly wise men bringing highly impractical gifts for a mum and a newborn baby. Gold and frankincense and myrrh. Not a nappy plan service amongst them. Okay? No crock pots, no casseroles, gold, frankincense and myrrh. Obviously there were no women amongst the magi. Okay? But they should not be there. They're not Jewish and they're astrologers. Do. Out. So we see what Matthew's doing. He's mixing and matching the best of the Old Testament with the best of the new wisdom of Jesus in that story. So the predictive element, as in long-term prediction, is secondary. The immediate significance is, of course, I'm speaking to you, read my lips. Okay? But then subsequently, the words become sacred scripture and we continue to read them and we continue to find meaning for us in words which were once addressed to somebody else. And so it becomes predictive. All right, what's happening next? These are the 4 horses of the apocalypse, of course. I love this graphic. It's not just because I used to be the president of the pony club at Corinda. I just think it's a wonderful graphic. Okay. And of course, you don't want to tangle with any of those, but especially the guy on the white horse. Okay. Wisdom and hope. So this is the 4th of the themes from the Old Testament that I want to tease out a bit today. And I've already alluded to this in a way. What happens, what are the circumstances of the Jewish people at around the time that the Old Testament is coming together? Okay. Well, they're living in someone else's empire. And they've got no chance of ever having an empire of their own. So how are they going to do it? Do they just drop it and become pagans? Or in what sense do they keep doing this weird Jewish thing which none of their neighbours seems to understand? Okay. So, wisdom and hope. So, what I want to suggest is that the latter parts of the Old Testament are composed in a different kind of key from some of the earlier parts of the Old Testament. So the prophetic literature, for instance, a lot of that comes out of the context when there were actual kings ruling in Jerusalem or in Samaria. And they could make decisions and they could change things. And the prophets wanted to have an influence on how the ruler was doing his job of running the people of God. But the game changes. The Egyptians have a resurgence, the Assyrians have a resurgence, and the little window of doing this Yahweh thing in Palestine closes. Okay. Yahweh, of course, is the name of God in the Jewish tradition. So the real world has re-emerged, the Egyptians are back on the southern border, and the Syrians or whoever are on the northern border, and they're setting the agenda. And there's very little prospect of the Jewish people having their own, even micro-state, let alone a big, wonderful empire. Okay? So the final parts of the Old Testament are in a very different context. Covenant is now something you have to live out in other people's empire. That's a bit tricky. So if that's the case, what does wisdom look like in that kind of world? So what world? We're talking particularly of the Persian world and then the Hellenistic world. Okay? So what does wisdom look like? Okay? Yahwistic wisdom in a world dominated by Persians and Greeks. what does hope look like now? In olden times, hope meant having a bit of land and a pile of kids. Okay? But what does hope look like in this kind of world? Where you might be living in diaspora in southern Turkey or northern Egypt or somewhere in Mesopotamia. Okay? What does hope look like for the people of God when they have no hope of being in charge ever again? Okay? So in other words, we're going to have to privatise the God thing. Okay? It's got to become a personal, private option rather than a statewide project. It's not, religion will not be a state enterprise, it'll be a private option. And this is unregulated opinion just flowing out now, of course. I suggest that religion without power is a source of grace, and the religion with power is an instrument of abuse. So how do we get the balance right? Okay? Because we don't want to be powerless. We want to be communities of grace. We want our schools to be communities of grace and to get good scores on that plan this week. But most of all, I think we want them to be communities of grace. So how do we do this? Okay. And what do we do with apocalyptic? Apocalyptic are those texts from the Old Testament and also the New Testament texts, which, if you like, are prophecy transposed into a different kind of key or different register. So let me just unpack a little bit of that and then we'll open it up for discussion. One of the things we see emerging through this part of Jewish history, which is also the time when presumably the Bible really comes together in terms of the Old Testament, is there's a discovery and a real focus on wisdom literature. One of the interesting things about wisdom literature is that it's not very Jewish. It's very international. In fact, there are bits of Proverbs which are turned up in the Egyptian texts. It's just a complete copy and paste. Okay, but it's become part of our Bible because it was imported into Jewish tradition somewhere in the ancient world. Okay, in other words, and if we stop and think about who are the people that have literacy, who are the people that have what little power there is left in Jewish society? Well, they're the people who deal with the relationships between our community and the empire. And they have to be literate, and they have to be able to survive in a pagan world, and we don't want them to lose their Jewish identity, but we understand they've got to move in a larger circle. Okay? And they're the kind of Daniels and Joseph type characters. And both of those stories are actually stories about how a good Jewish boy survives in a pagan empire and succeeds. It becomes indeed a source of blessing to his people because of his ability to live in two worlds. That's wisdom at near the end of the Old Testament. Okay? The wisdom literature, which includes things like Proverbs, of course, and also Job and Ecclesiastes, would be put as wisdom literature. Within the Old Testament Apocrypha, there are 2 or 3 other wisdom texts, like the wisdom of Solomon and the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach. We sometimes forget there are other people called Jesus in the Jewish world, of course. And many of them had a mum called Mary, because half the Jewish girls were given Mary or Miriam as their name. Very common name on the class roll. Okay. So the wisdom literature actually is not interested in and makes no use of the Exodus traditions and the covenant traditions, because the wisdom literature is not invested in the things that make us different, it's more invested in the things that make us the same and what counts for wisdom in the world we live in. Okay? So if you read through the book of Proverbs, lots of wonderful wisdom there, but it's not very Jewish. There's no debt to Moses, It doesn't talk about Exodus. It's not into miracles. It's not about the Ten Commandments. It's about working hard. Don't be lazy. Get up early. Finish your assignments. All that kind of stuff. Be nice to the king, and so on. Be nice to the boss. That always helps. So they're the kinds of issues that take prominence, if you like, in the wisdom text. Apocalyptic texts are a bit different. At first glance, wisdom and apocalyptic are poles apart. Okay? Wisdom is about doing the things that will just help everything keep ticking over, and avoid disasters. Don't lend money to people that can't pay you back. They're being sort of prudent in the way you manage your affairs. Apocalyptic is going right out on a limb and being prepared to die for your faith, which is not very prudent. Okay, there's no longevity in martyrdom. Okay, but apocalyptic literature is almost, it says, going to the other extreme and say, no, it's about resistance. It's not about accommodation. So in some respects, wisdom literature is about accommodation, and apocalyptic literature is about resistance. So what's happening? Now, of course, I'm going to be suggesting it's the same group of people. The people that are writing the apocalyptic texts, of which Daniel is one of the most famous. It's the most explicitly apocalyptic text in the Old Testament, but there are a few other bits of apocalyptic texts in Isaiah and Zechariah and so on. They're looking for God to step in, blow the whistle, everybody out of the pool. Okay, time's up. Now, the wisdom literature is saying, no, that's not going to happen, so let's just get used to it and buy houses and plant vineyards and get on with life. Okay, so there's a tension at one level between the instinct of the wisdom literature, which is, let's make it work, and the apocalypse is saying, it's not going to work, it's broken, this is going nowhere, we really need God to come, and we need God to come real fast and sort this out, because we can no longer do it ourselves. And that's the difference between prophecy and apocalyptic. The prophet said, excuse me, king, you can turn this around, and if you don't turn it around, God will destroy this city. The apocalyptists are saying, there's nothing we can do except be faithful and wait for God to turn up, and God will clean up the mess. And God's way of cleaning up the mess tends to be violent and destructive and show no mercy to the people we don't like. Okay, so it's projecting our frustration and our desire for validation and revenge onto God, who will then, of course, have the capacity to implement it. So within the Jewish community, around the time that we can imagine the Old Testament, in a sense, coming together, these are kind of two of the dynamics that are at work. For a lot of people, the best course of action was keep your head down, fit in. That's an option. Just kind of go along with the flow. There are other people who said, no, we can't fit in, we never did fit in, and we're not going to fit in now, and we're going to resist, and even if it costs us our life, okay, we believe in the end, with capital E, God will make everything right. Okay. Now, I think the book of Daniel, one of the reasons the book of Daniel is fascinating, because it has both those kind of dynamics in the one book. You do have what appear to be, the basic characterization are young men who have been trained to work in the imperial administration and to get on with their careers, but they're not fitting in. And particularly the story of the fiery furnace, and Daniel the lion's den. They're characters that are not fitting in. When you get to the second part of the book of Daniel, it is very much about resistance, it's very much about apocalyptic intervention and God's destruction of the pagan empires, so that in the end, the kingdom of God will emerge. Okay? The kingdom of the saints, the kingdom of the holy ones. Now there's a very particular historical moment which seems to be reflected in the book of Daniel, and that's the Maccabean rebellion. And it goes to the heart of this dynamic between accommodation and resistance. Following the Persian Empire was followed by the conquest of Alexander the Great. Only 2 or 3 people get that little extra label in ancient history, but Alexander is one of them. And interestingly, a large number of the Roman emperors, particularly in the 2nd and 3rd century, used Alexander as one of their throne names, because they all wanted to be seen as a bit of an Alexander, really. Okay. So you've got the conquest of Alexander, which happens pretty quickly, over a 10, 13-year period, and then he catches a cold, catches pneumonia, and dies, which is a bit of a problem, really, for the story. Okay, so his massive empire is divided between 3 of his senior generals, and 2 of them in particular are significant for the biblical story. The general called Ptolemy gets Egypt, and Egypt included Palestine, of course, as well as some of the islands. Okay, and one of his rivals, one of the other generals, a guy called Seleucus, gets Syria, and I think Turkey, and through to Mesopotamia, and theoretically probably as far as Afghanistan. Now, the line between the Seleucid domain and the Ptolemaic domain is the Lebanese mountain range, the same old historical division. Okay. Just after 200 BCE, I think it was 198, there's a battle at what in the ancient world was called Panias, but in modern Arabic is called Banias, because Arabic doesn't have the P letter. Okay, so the capital of France is Baris, with a B. Okay, so Banias or Panias, or also known as Caesarea Philippi. Way up in the north, there's a major battle there, the end result of which is that the Egyptian empire, run by the Ptolemies, loses control of Palestine. So the Seleucids take over direct control of Palestine, which is then their southwestern province on the border with Egypt, which is the border they're wanting to push against, because they want to take over Egypt. Eventually the Seleucids are prevented from taking over Egypt because Rome sends an envoy who literally draws a line in the sand and says to Antiochus, if you send your forces over that line, you will be at war with Rome. Okay, interesting. We're still using those strategies. Don't always work. Now, so you've got a political situation set up where Jerusalem has recently found itself incorporated into the Seleucid Empire rather than, say, the Egyptian Ptolemaic Empire. The Ptolemaics had been pretty laissez-faire. They'd really just left Jerusalem to run their own affairs, provided they paid the agreed tax. All's good. The Seleucids were not quite as standoff, and of course the Seleucids had a strategic interest in having a very tight control of what was happening on the southwest border, the border with Egypt. And that plays into internal dynamics in Jerusalem, where 2 or 3 rival contenders for the high priest outbid each other in a bidding competition called competitive tendering with the king of the Syrians to get the job of high priest. Okay, now this eventually leads to the Maccabean rebellion and the incredible stories about Jewish bravery and resistance that come out of that. So roughly 175 to 200 years before the time of Jesus, the conflict between accommodation and resistance gets to a flashpoint. Okay, and the book of Daniel probably comes out of that experience. Okay, now it talks about it as if the issue were back 300, 400 years earlier, because that's safe. Okay, that's sort of cover. But what Daniel is talking about is precisely what's going on in Jerusalem in the Maccabean crisis. Okay, in the first 20, 30 years or so of the 2nd century before the time of Christ. So we get wisdom and hope. And it's in that context, interestingly, that not only do we find, say, apocalyptic really crystallizing and flowering, but that's where we also get the discovery of the idea of resurrection. Okay, Daniel is the only part of the Old Testament which talks about resurrection of the faithful departed. Okay, in the normal Jewish world, they go to Sheol and they stay there. And depending how good or bad you've been, you get nicer seats. Okay, so the righteous, they're near the heater and they're sort of looked after, and the uncircumcised and the Philistines, they're on the outer edge of Sheol. Okay, they're barely hanging in the place of the dead. But there's no resurrection. Okay? But in the context of resistance and martyrdom, then hope gets reborn with the idea of resurrection. See, nobody expected Moses to be resurrected in the Old Testament tradition. Nobody talks of Abraham being resurrected, David, Solomon, whatever. Elijah's different because he doesn't get to die. He's just hanging around upstairs waiting for the end of the world. Okay, but through the Old Testament, until you get to Daniel, there's no prospect of life after death. And particularly, there's no prospect of resurrection.
Is that just in that last chapter?
Chapter 12 of Daniel, yeah. And even then, it's very vague.
Yeah.
It's not, it's a elusive kind of thing. They'll become like the stars in heaven, and so on. And it's really more what's technically called apotheosis, the deceased person joining the gods and being almost ascending into heaven and becoming one of the stars. Yeah. But that idea becomes really important during the next 200 years or so in Jewish thought, and of course is absolutely centre game when it comes to the Christian story. Okay, so wisdom and hope. What does wisdom look like when we live in a world that we don't control? When do we resist? And what shape, what form does hope take? How can we be religious without having lots of power? Okay, we've still got a bit of time left, so let's kick some of those ideas around and see what your thoughts are. Or anything else that you want to raise, but I'm happy to talk about. So if there are themes which you're surprised I didn't think of, this is certainly not exhaustive, but I picked what I thought of as the 4 big ones: Torah and covenant, land and power, prophecy and justice, wisdom and hope. Okay, now there are many different ways of cutting the Old Testament, as it were, but they're 4 big themes which I thought I picked on those because they could be themes around which you could build a curriculum. They could be cluster. You could have stories and activities and texts and other things around those themes as big picture sort of clusters coming out of the Old Testament.